My name is Wendy Buckley, and this is the recording from the Sustainable Business Network event on supply chain sustainability from the 19th of March.
On the agenda today, then, we'll start off with the usual legal and market updates. And then second up, we have Bays on supply chain sustainability, followed on by the supply chain carbon footprinting to be presented by my colleague, Miles Howard. Let's start with a quick question then. Are you measuring your supply chain footprint? This will take you through to Microsoft Forms and a couple of quick questions there to do a poll to see what we're all doing now. Since we last met in January, quite a few things have happened. Certainly the incentive and desire for green growth as we come out of the pandemic is front and centre. Several things that you can see on screen there, and I know that our friends from Bays today will be telling us a lot more about the race to zero and COP26, and we can see some of the images there on screen. Over this time also, Bill Gates produced his book, published a couple of weeks ago, and you can see there's me reading the book. It's a good read if you haven't had a chance to get to that yet, really saying that the playing field needs to be leveled between the cost of the green options and fossil fuel driven options. He talks about those types of taxes and that the only way is via net zero. So that's what Bill Gates, whether you like him or you don't, obviously he's hugely influential, and that's the way he would like to see the world going. Technologies are improving, and one feature has been the Freedom Flight Prize, which is the £1 million plus prize for the first truly zero carbon flight across the Atlantic in a 100-seater plane. This is zero carbon aviation for the masses. And programs like that are going to serve to accelerate and educate at the same time. So those things are very important. The workplace is still changing, and here we can see here's my managing director still working from home, and I think we can all expect some degree of blended working for some time to come, and whether the world actually moves to that particular position is yet to be seen. We also seen some of our retailers move to do more with recycling of their plastics, and hoping that that's at the front end of things and others will follow suit. So there is this sense of moving to a greener place as we move out of the pandemic. The International Energy Agency has done its review of 2020, and maybe no big surprises. The carbon emissions did go down last year, and we all know the reasons why. But if we point at the specifics that add to this, the road transport and aviation were two key areas that were reduced, and clearly those can't remain there unless we do some significant steps to electrify those. We've already mentioned the Freedom Flight Prize and those things with zero carbon flying, but also road transport needs to move in the same way to electrification. We always like to tell you about fines and things that are happening for transgressions of environmental law, and we'll just pick out a few things here. There are hyperlinks on the end, so I will be giving you some homework to have a look at those later. Thames Water had a big fine of £2.3 million for a transgression in Henley-on-Thames that hit the news a couple of weeks ago. If I were being a little bit, not churlish, what is the word here? I would make the comparison between the size of that fine and the turnover of the business. Flybe had a very big fine for failure to fully meet the EU ETS requirements for their carbon emissions on flying. That has happened. And other things related to farming water violations. Their new legislations came in a few years ago, and even though 243 violations have been recorded, prosecutions haven't been seen in place for that. I suspect that's down to resource at the moment, but it'd be good to see more of those things being recognised. Streamlined energy and carbon reporting, I think we're all familiar with now for large entities reporting their carbon emissions in their annual reports. It's now entering the second year of reporting. Why is this significant? Well, because this is the first time that the comparison between years needs to be made. And whilst SECR does not require you to actually reduce the emissions, it does now require that in that second year to compare them. We can only speculate that as we go forward, there will be a requirement then to reduce, and we'll move on to what that means in the next slides. If you're uncertain of whether your business is within a CCR, please follow the links at the end. Other things happening. Pleased to say there seems to be some movement on the environmental watchdog. These are really post-Brexit things we're talking about here, of who's really monitoring us and what we do. The environmental watchdog is going to be live in July of this year. I believe it is in Bristol, and Dame Glynis Stacey is to chair that. The UK is launching its own ETS trading system. It will work in a similar way to the EU ETS, but we are promised that the caps will be lower and the fines will be higher. This is in place and operative from May this year. You can register now on gov.uk for that as well. There's a link at the end to look at that. Right to repair is something that we've talked about before, and this is the legislation taken on the UK statute book requiring manufacturers to produce spare parts so we don't get so much equipment thrown away. Let's talk about other post-Brexit things, and these really relate to land and farming. Obviously, these are huge sources of carbon emissions across the country, and there are a number of pilot initiatives here for sustainable farming and local nature recovery and landscape recovery in place from 2021, and then scaling up subsequently, that are going to deliver some impressive reductions in carbon emissions. And we can all read on the end there, within the first 4 years, taking out 100,000 tonnes of CO2 and then moving up to 300,000 tonnes in the subsequent 4 years there. So there's some important steps to target the land-based emissions. The Chancellor Rishi Sunak gave his budget just recently, and obviously reports over the last day on the changes to the electric vehicle grants have not gone down well with the motor industry, reducing the grants for plug-in vehicles, and also reducing the amount that you can have on EVs. I think it's now got a ceiling of £35,000 as the limit on the grant for purchase price on an EV. Not gone down well within the industry over the last day or so. There are some extensions to some great grant programs, and things like the RHI and Green Homes grants have now extended to March 22. So that is something that is welcomed. And also a couple of other initiatives. The National Infrastructure Bank is going to support decarbonisation there, and also Net Zero Innovation Fund to bring some of those technologies along. And one interesting example there is the requirement for floating offshore wind projects. This is very much on a competitive basis. Those grants are going to be provided. So please follow the links on the end if you are interested in finding out more about those. If you'd rather invest in the green development, we have the sovereign green bonds coming online from the summer. So please do have a look about this. And the whole net zero initiative is to be added to the Bank of England's remit, which, as you hope it would be. Here's a whole page of homework, finally, for you to have a look at. Lots of things on there. As I say, we'll be sharing these slides later on for you to follow those up. Lots of things to look at. I realise that not all of this will be of interest to everyone, but I'm sure there's one or two bits in there which will be significant and relevant to the industry that you're in. So that's the end of the legal market update. And what I'd like to do now is to introduce Alistair Silverman and Catherine Westerby from BEIS for our keynote presentation today. Over to you, Alistair and Catherine, please.
Thanks, Wendy. Good morning, everyone. It's great to speak to you this morning. It's great to see so many businesses interested in supply chain management and carbon footprint. As Wendy touched on, Catherine and I will be speaking, and we have some beautiful slides, of course. It wouldn't be a presentation without them, but it always helps if I actually put them up on the screen. So yeah, today I'm going to be covering with Catherine what is COP26, how the government sees your business playing a role, and that's to do with Race to Zero, as we've already heard, and all the different ways you can get involved, whether you're running a florist on the high street or one of the biggest companies in Britain. But before we begin, I just wanted to, not a disclaimer, but just to set the scene. Catherine and I work at the Domestic Business Department, BEIS, and we work in the International Climate Change Directorate. So although we have agreed policy lines from our colleagues at DEFRA and other departments, and although tackling emissions and protecting our natural world are cross-departmental priorities, we won't be able to speak in detail to those, but we're happy to follow up with any questions. If you are already in contact with, say, the policy team on the emissions trading scheme, they'll be able to give you the most detail. So, but if you want to talk about businesses getting involved in COP26, businesses taking green action, cutting emissions, then we're your people. So I'll begin. Just a little headline. I'm sure you're all aware of what COP26 is, but just in case you've been living under a very large rock, it's, in short, it's 2 weeks of UN climate negotiations. And it's going to take place this year in Glasgow. And it's one of the UK government's biggest priorities, but it's also important for the world, because we have to wind back 5 years to Paris, where the Paris Agreement came about, which I'm sure you've heard of, but just to clarify, it was the first legally binding treaty that pretty much all the countries in the world signed up to, and the headline aim was to cut emissions in line with keeping global warming at 1.5 degrees. The exact wording is slightly different, but 1.5 degrees is the number to remember. Now, if that all happened in Paris, why is Glasgow important? Well, the treaty set out that within the following 5 to 6 years, countries would align their actions with these promises. And Glasgow is the deadline. So unfortunately, at the moment, if all commitments by countries were carried out, we would end up with 3 to 4 degrees warming, which would involve catastrophic loss of life, but also extreme damage to business, of course. So this year, we're seeing the closing of that gap. People are coming out with more and more commitments, but in Glasgow, that's when we're going to see a real pivotal change. Just to place this in context, the UK itself has a net zero 2050 goal. So Glasgow is a very, very important milestone, but it's one milestone in a 30-year story. And also to point out that the UK will become COP president alongside Italy for the 12 months that follow the conference. So this isn't a flash in the pan. It's a long time, super important cross-government objective. So yeah, I'm going to move on to how your business gets involved. Enough of the international politics. Now, Race to Zero, we've already touched on, and we'll go into more detail. But in short, this is anyone who's under political leaders, and by that I mean the people who actually carry out the change we're going to have to see. So it's all good and well, politicians saying we want to cut emissions, but we know it's investors, universities, local government, and of course business that actually makes this change happen. So the Race to Zero is basically the Paris Agreement, but for everyone who's not a global politician. You commit to cutting your emissions in line with a 1.5 degree, and we'll come on to how your business can get involved in that. But that's our main ask, and we tie that together with all our other climate work in something called Together for Our Planet. And that's the way the government and wider society can recognize that COP's super, super important. We sometimes say that Together for Our Planet is like the torch relay ahead of the Olympics, with Glasgow being the Climate Olympics. But if you've kept your breakfast down, all you need to know is wherever you see Together for Our Planet branding in this coming year means it's aligned with COP26, and it also means it's a great opportunity to get involved in whichever way. And as you can see from the slide, that's going to lead to engagement with the public, so people are aware of the summit, but also engagement with business. Now, where does Andrew fit into all of this? For any of you who don't know, Andrew Griffith is a Conservative MP for Arndale. I always say the name of his village wrong, but it's the South Downs. But prior to this, he worked for Sky and Just Eat and was in banking. So he's a real sort of traditional Conservative politician, businessman. but he's also aware of the great opportunity for net zero for cutting emissions for business. And he used to advise the Prime Minister, so he has great cross-Whitehall links. So he's a perfect fit to be championing net zero businesses who are taking action and also unblocking some of those obstacles, as we saw in the news stories at the start from Wendy, that may be there for businesses, and leveling the playing field, as Bill Gates has talked about. So Andrew's got three main priority areas: the big business campaign, which I will speak about in more detail, the small and micro business campaign, which Catherine leads on and we'll be talking about, and finally the Global Green Investment Summit, which touches on both. But now on to what your larger business can do in relation to the race to zero. And if you're here from an SME or a small business, however you would define yourself, the business case and whatnot are often aligned. So yeah, it's still going to be interesting for you, so to speak. And of course, Catherine will be talking about that. So I already talked about the race to zero, but the main things we want you to remember from this is it's the #1 government ask. We know businesses have had a very tough year, and we also know that you might be interested in taking action on climate, but you're wondering what's the best way of doing this. Today we're talking about supply chains, and Race to Zero is great for a number of different measures, but including your supply chain. It helps you focus on having the biggest impact on your emissions, and also has an awareness of all the emissions you have influence on. So not just within your business, within your supply chain upstream and downstream, but also if you're one business within a very long supply chain, Race to Zero is the best way your people you're buying and working with can recognize that you're taking action on climate, because it's the UN-backed global campaign, so it doesn't matter where you are in the world, people have heard about it and know about it and recognize it. It's got a range of different actors, so business, investors, universities, but it's an umbrella. And by that we mean, of course, with all these different actors, to get the biggest possible coalition and raise the possibility of change, we can't have one set number of rules. So instead, the Race to Zero acts as the referee, you could say, and then initiatives approach the UN Race to Zero team and say, I feel that my commitments the business make or whoever make are stringent enough to be aligned with the Paris Agreement. So you might see different companies joining Race to Zero and they've all taken different paths. But the business case for doing so remains. Now you're all here, you're all spending your Friday morning, so you'll be aware that investors and shareholders increasingly want to see action on climate change. And you must also be aware that it's a great way of engaging with both your consumers and your workforce. We feel that Race to Zero gets you the most bang for your buck. And by that, I mean, it focuses your business attention on where you can best affect change, where you can best do your bit, so to speak, but also where you'll be unlocking the cost savings from efficiency gains, from reducing your exposure to policy changes. And of course, you get your most exposure, your most bang for buck for positive exposure, be that with us as the government or in the many private sector forums where Race to Zero is being talked about. I've already spoken about how Glasgow is a really big deadline, but it's such an important point. Governments have legally committed to cutting their emissions within 1.5. We're seeing, every week there's more and more commitments coming out, more positive sounds from the US, from China, from the EU. The UK has already released its new NDC. So it's about ensuring you've got a plan for your business, that it's both effective and more resilient, but you're ahead of the curve. Not just so you look like you're a leader for your consumers and your investors, but it's about reducing that risk and doing the change at your own time. So there's the business case. I've spoken about how it affects your supply chains, and we can go into more detail on that. But I know businesses aren't bureaucrats. They actually want to get on and do things. So I want to talk about one of the main routes into the Race to Zero, one of the main accredited, some people call them the accreditatory entry points, so you can be running with other businesses. And it's called Business Ambition for 1.5 degree. Some of you may already have heard of the Science Based Target Initiative. It's part of their work. Doesn't matter if you haven't. There's 3 easy steps. Of course, you've got to understand where your emissions are, which scopes they're in, and therefore what your responsibility is for each of those scopes. Once you've got that all lined up and you obviously understand the impact it's going to have on your business, but maybe you don't have your plans 100% ironed out, your CEO can sign a letter, which is linked here, but we can circulate. And it just states that they agree with the Paris Agreement. They understand why it's important to get to 1.5, and they're going to take action on their business's role in that, so it's aligned with a 1.5 degree world. What does that mean in plain speak? It means if everyone were to do those actions for their patch, we would already be on our way to 1.5, and it would all be rosy, and climate change would be solved, so to speak. Obviously, it's a little bit more complex than that. So sign this letter, and then it goes for accreditation, two-step accreditation with the Race to Zero scientists and experts, but it's not a super long process. It's very well respected, and you may not automatically pass, but it's not going to take too long. It can take just a month. Then you're accepted into the race because you've stated your ambition publicly, and you need to get that recognition. We need to show that there is momentum and an appetite for this and an understanding. So that's the really wonderful thing. You are recognized for stepping up very early in the process. You then have, depending on your background, but it's normally 2 years to work with the Science Based Targets initiative and submit an emissions reduction plan. As you would submit a business plan to the bank, you would be submitting, these are my emissions, and they would come back to you and say, yep, you're there, or no, you need to tweak this. And once that's approved, off you go. And there's recording requirements to, of course, maintain standards. But what I want to draw out from this is you can get into the Race to Zero quite early, depending on how well you can understand your emissions and the implications of cost, of course. You don't need to have all your ducks in a row, so to speak. You can sign that letter and get recognition early on, and then you've got this 2-year period to cross the T's and dot the I's and just make sure everything's lined up. And the last thing I would say is, this is covered in this next slide, but it's a bit wordy. So although it's called the Business Ambition for 1.5, some of the large businesses may already say, well, we can get to well below 2, but we're waiting on CCUS or hydrogen or some other technology that we know is coming and that we trust in, but isn't there yet. You can sign the pledge and go for a slower reduction in the first few periods. So that can be up to 5-15 years, on the assumption that after that, when this new technology kicks in, obviously your emissions will drop a lot more sharply than before, and you'll make up for lost time. But what to take from this is the Business Ambition Pledge is designed with business in mind. We want as many people to be able to access it as possible, and we want it to be tailored to your business's needs. So even if maybe you've looked at this before and it was difficult, I really would implore you to get in touch with us. We can talk through the options, and of course we can talk through, if that is not within your company's reach, we can talk through many of the other ways you can support COP26, the government's aims around that. I won't go into these in so much detail at the moment, but if you've got questions about them, then please do raise in the chat, because I want to pass over to Catherine, who's going to speak to us about the small business campaign. These are just, oh, sorry, I've forgotten the most exciting bit in my enthusiasm to get onto the small business campaign. But we don't want business to feel that it's all stick, so to speak. You must do this. We feel it's best for your business. We want to, of course, talk about the carrots, and that's not just for the color of my hair and my love of baking carrot cake. It's all about what your business can get out of it. I've talked about Andrew Griffith. There's a lot of big figures in government, such as the Prime Minister, Mark Carney, Nigel Topping, although Mark and Nigel aren't officially in government, but they're working closely with the government, who are supportive of this agenda. There's many ways to get involved in events that are coming up throughout the year. We've talked about the Global Green Investment Summit. That's going to be happening in the autumn. It's all about demonstrating the UK is a great place to invest and great green technologies. But if you want to host an event showing what you're doing in your sector, what you're doing with your supply chain, then please do let us know, because we'd love to support. Anyway, I'm aware of time, and I do want to pass over to Catherine. So Yeah, that's it for now, and happy to take questions at the end. Catherine?
Thanks, Alistair. If you wouldn't mind moving to the next slide, please. Thank you. So Alistair's given a really good overview of why, we're targeting big business and the important role that they have to play. And I'm going to talk about why we're targeting smaller businesses, because I think the case needs to be made, especially after the year that we've all had, and especially, small businesses have been incredibly hard hit. Why are we bothering talking to small businesses about net zero? What's in it for them? What's in it for us? What are we trying to achieve here? So it's important to recognise when we're talking about small businesses and net zero that business and industry accounts for 25% of UK territorial emissions, and that small businesses make up over 99% of the 5.87 million enterprises in the UK. So to be honest, they are the bulk. When we talk about business in the UK, we're really talking about small and medium-sized enterprises. That's the bulk of our business community in the UK. So it's really, really important that we focus on them, and we honestly don't want them to feel that they're left out. So we want this campaign ahead of COP26 to be inclusive. So it's all about making small businesses feel that they can make a difference, and they are obviously incredibly important in that regard. Next slide, please. So what are we hoping to achieve with this campaign? So Andrew, again, is absolutely committed to targeting small and micro businesses. He cares very deeply about them. It's something that he's keen to talk about openly as well. So we want to raise awareness of climate change among small businesses and their consumers. So we understand that businesses do want to do their bit. They do want to help address climate change. They see that as a very important issue. They just don't quite know how to go about it. So what we want to do as part of this campaign, again, is to raise awareness, to sort of demonstrate how easy it is to take actions on net zero, how easy it is for them to play their part and make them feel included. We want to then encourage uptake of specific actions. So we have a new digital platform launching shortly, which I will talk about, where we have a one-stop shop and advice service for small businesses that's aligned to the Race to Zero, that explains very clearly and very simply what we want them to do. So we want them to take certain actions, some of which they're going to be taking already. So a part of this is making them realise that they may have already started their net zero journey. For example, we've all been working from home. That's something that, again, is going to reduce your transport emissions. So just making it clear that this is something that is accessible for small businesses. It's something that they can do. And then we want to generate place-based interest and lots of press coverage. So we want to use this as an opportunity to celebrate what small businesses are doing, what they're already doing, the ambition that they're demonstrating already, and the actions that they're going to take over the next 6 months, also in the run-up to COP26. And again, really just celebrate their actions there. Next slide, please. So in terms of the road to COP26, the exciting things we have planned, we've Andrew, as Alistair mentioned, is our UK Net Zero Business Champion. He was appointed in November last year. We have the soft launch of his digital platform, which is going to form part of the SME Climate Hub. So as Alistair mentioned, you've got the Global Race to Zero, which is an umbrella initiative which covers lots of different organisations, including the Business Ambition to 1.5. Part of that is the SME Climate Hub, which again is tailored towards small and medium-sized enterprises. It is quite international in scope, it's quite global. Again, we don't feel it's quite tailored to our UK domestic audience. So what Andrew's done is, with his team, is to design a new digital platform that will sit on the SME Climate Hub, which is going to be domestic in focus. So solely focused on small and micro businesses at that end of the spectrum in the UK. So making it relevant to them, celebrating what they're doing via case studies, etc. And I'll talk about that a little bit in a moment. The official campaign launch will be slightly later this year, so we're looking at May, but again, we're going to have to release more an actual date closer to the time. We have lots and lots of regional events planned, so one of which is today with the Northern Powerhouse, so I'm going to leave this meeting and go on to that one. We have Andrew speaking there, we have Lord Callanan speaking, and it's going to be a really exciting way to engage small businesses in their local area across the Northern Powerhouse. And we have many more planned in the lead up to COP26 in November. Next slide, please. So in terms of the various campaign strands within the small and micro business campaign, so we've obviously got national campaign. So Andrew convened a task force, a high-level task force in December last year that covers CEOs from companies such as Google, NatWest, BT, Royal Mail. So he's brought them together to understand how they can disseminate this campaign via their supply chains, via their membership bases. It's a really, really sort of important top-down national campaign to make sure that we reach small businesses, because they're often out in their vans, they're in their shops, we need to make sure that we're sort of putting this campaign in front of them. So the way that we can do that, again, is to use tools like Google, is to use utility bills, for example, to really sort of reach into that small business space and make sure that we're presenting this campaign to them in the most direct way. So again, that kicks off around about May. Then, as I said, we've got a whole host of regional events that we're holding. We held one in the Midlands back in February. We've got the Northern Powerhouse event today. We have many more planned. Then place-based engagements. So a lot of this is in the works at the minute. So we really want to work with local enterprise partnerships, for example, local communities, to really mobilize small businesses and really, again, celebrate what they're doing, to give them an opportunity to shout about their net zero ambition, to tell their local businesses, their peers, to tell their consumers, for example, to tell others. So we just see them as a really, really sort of really exciting way to get the message out about COP, really. And then through the digital platform, eventually we're going to specialize by sector, because clearly, a local law firm is going to be very different, have very different energy needs to a local restaurant, for example. So we recognize that lots of the actions we want them to take on net zero are going to be specialized by sector. So we want to make sure that we're tailoring advice where possible and making it as applicable to them as possible. Next slide, please. So in terms of the digital platform, again, very exciting. It's going to be launching soon. That's aimed at driving sign-ups to the Race to Zero. So we're focusing again on small and micro businesses and making them feel that net zero is something that's good for business. Ultimately, the case we're making is that you can save money, you can build your business, you can become more sustainable in the future, and that this is obviously going to be attractive. As Alistair mentioned, the same case is going to be made to big businesses. This is good for investors, good for consumers, and good for the planet. We're going to communicate, again, the relevance of climate change through that narrative to small businesses. Again, it's a one-stop shop advice service on net zero for small businesses, so they can access lots and lots of support and advice. And again, we've made an effort to make it as clear and accessible as possible to your average high street shop, for example. We understand that while bigger businesses have entire departments dedicated to net zero, dedicated to sustainability, small businesses don't have that. So we fully appreciate that. And again, it's completely tailored. This support and advice is tailored to make sure that it is accessible and easy to do. And again, we're going to elevate their actions, present latest news and advice. That's all right. Thanks, Alistair. Move on, please. So in terms of campaign activity, so again, lots and lots of events planned, lots of press coverage in the works. We want to make sure that everyone shouts about this, and that, again, we hold up small businesses as exemplars, that we really do celebrate the actions that they're going to be taking and make it clear that this is something that anyone can do. Anyone can reach net zero. Again, it's important for their business and is going to contribute to reducing our UK emissions overall. So we do that again via case studies. So we have a whole host of case studies on the website ready to go from a whole range of different businesses across the country, different types of business doing different things. But importantly, they're all on the same page in terms of wanting to tackle climate change, wanting to do their bit, and we want to help showcase those efforts. Next slide, please. So in terms of how small businesses can help, the first thing they can do is sign up to the Race to Zero. So, make that commitment clear, tell us that you want to make a difference, and we will help you achieve net zero for your business. And obviously, we want you to bring others along with you. We want you to promote the campaign, again, among local businesses, among your consumers. We want it to be something that they can shout about, be proud of, show that they're committed to building back greener, for example. So there will be, come the hard launch, a lot of social media toolkits, for example, that we're going to be sharing with them so that they can make that case. Again, sharing tools and opportunities. We want to make sure, again, we're very, very conscious that there are lots and lots of initiatives out there across the UK. Lots of different organisations are already, showcasing what they're doing ahead of COP26. They're launching their own campaigns. But what's really important is that we align everyone under the Race to Zero campaign, so everyone understands that there is that one single simple ask. We don't want to confuse things further. We understand there's lots of different terminology out there, for example. So we just want to make it as clear and simple as possible. And we will again be sharing media toolkits to help other organisations and businesses align their campaigns with the Race to Zero. So we're all moving together in the same direction. And again, fundamentally, we want to highlight best practice. We want to tell the story of these small businesses. We want to make net zero inspiring. I think that's the end of my presentation.
Catherine and Alistair, thank you so much for a fantastic presentation there on and great to have the focus on the race to zero. And I think, that really does for me bridge the gap between these big sort of goals that the country has committed to and what each and every one of us can do as a business to contribute into that. What I think I'll do now, if you'd like to stop sharing your screen for a moment. Actually, there is a question here that is about the emissions factors for the supply chain assessment of carbon. I'm not sure actually if this is a question, Alistair and Catherine, for you. I do know that my colleague Miles Howard is actually going to address some specifics on supply chain conversion factors. But since obviously it is Catherine and Alistair, you are presenting at the moment, perhaps you had a response on it's whether the factors and the methodologies for assessing supply chain footprints has been updated over recent times.
I'm just reading the question now, Wendy. Catherine, feel free to jump in if you... As I don't have the lines of the policy on that, but I'm happy to take that away. Catherine, I don't know if you've come across that in your work.
No, I haven't come across that, but it's definitely a very sensible question, and we can get back to you with the latest on that one.
Okay, I've got a quick question actually. I think we might address some of the issues about methodologies and numbers in Miles's presentation that's coming up just shortly. Actually, I've had someone anonymously email across, how much does it cost to sign up? Apologies if we've missed for the net zero. Are there any cost implications on businesses for doing that?
So on the large business, I'd have to double check my notes, but I think it is several £1,000s. I need to double check that. Catherine, do you know what it is for the SME one?
So it's completely free for small businesses. So again, the way that the SME Climate Hub is designed is again to make it accessible for small businesses. So we don't want to put them off. We understand they absolutely don't have, a large business, with an enormous turnover is going to be able to afford, I think it's about £5,000 to have this assessment done. So again, they're paying for a service, and they make sure that everything, as Alistair said, is in line, with 1.5, and that they've ticked all the right boxes, crossed the T's and dotted the I's. But again, the small business sign up process is entirely free and much more simplified for them, to make sure again that we don't scare them off.
For clarity there, that would be in the definition of SMEs, so the sub 250 employees, or the I know there are a couple of other things with balance sheet and turnover as well, just to be clear on that one.
Exactly. So broadly speaking, the SME Climate Hub itself is anything under 500 employees, just to keep it really simple with the company's house definition. Obviously, there's other factors, but the small and micro business campaign is under 250. So again, broadly speaking, any small and medium-sized enterprise will not have to pay to join the Race to Zero.
Great. Okay. I think we're getting a few more questions in there. Alistair and Catherine, are you able to respond to those ones that come through here? Is there a plan to support charities in joining Race to Zero? That's a good question.
So there should be, it depends on what sort of charity, but the Race to Zero team, who are called the Climate Champions team under Nigel Topping, are always open to new initiatives. So if you and some other charities have a plan about what you'd like to see there, then they'd be open to that being submitted. And I can pass on our contact there's email, and she can speak in more detail. And I can also send around the PDF, which relates to, is basically the application form. It's about 3 pages, and there's 22 separate questions on what you should be looking for in your initiative.
Okay, maybe we can append those onto the slides when they finally go out there. Another question there, will the commitment to business sustainability include giving extra credit to sustainable businesses in government procurement? I'm just reading out the question there.
Yeah, I think that's again a really, really good question. We get that from small businesses in particular all the time, saying, what advantage does this give me? I'm signing up to the Race to Zero. Does that mean I can get, a government contract more easily? Does that mean that this is going to be, really beneficial for my business in the longer term? And we obviously give them assurances, again, that we know that investors are keen on this. We know that consumers want this. You know, we talk about attracting the green pound, for example. But that's something that I think we want to take forward and look into in a bit more detail post-COP. So again, very, very keenly aware that businesses want that from us. They want to be able to get ahead of the curve, to show that they're taking the initiative and be rewarded for that. So again, happy to look into that and see what we can do from a policy perspective.
I'm just going to take one final question there that is on the screen, then we will need to move on in the interest of time there. About there are quite a number of initiatives out there at the moment. How will we align them all? That's an excellent question. Catherine, Alistair, your response, please.
So I will come to that question, but I just wanted to double check on the question about how much does it cost to join the Race to Zero. Depends which initiative you're going for, but I'll talk about the one that we push that we think is the best, the Business Ambition for 1.5. Doesn't cost anything to sign that letter. So you, strictly speaking, you will be joining the Race to Zero for free. However, the letter is committing you to setting a science-based target and having that verified in the same way your accounts will be verified by an accountant. And that process costs 5,000 American dollars.
Right, so it's the SBT costs that really you're citing there rather than the Race to Zero.
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
Get you.
And
got
you
you.
get
I got you.
sort of two, what's the phrase? You get 2 goes to submit plans and then for them to go through in detail. So yeah, and the question about there appears to be a wide range of existing initiatives. How do you plan to align them? Well, that's the point of the Race to Zero campaign. There's been enough talk. We now need action. It needs to be 1.5 or aligning to 1.5 or not. So on emissions, the Race to Zero is saying, you know, if you've got an initiative, if you've got a climate plan and you think it's good, come and talk to us and we'll verify it. And then we're all happy. That's more people in our race and you get the kite mark. On the other initiatives to do with maybe deforestation or electric vehicles, we have a select few that the government feels are the best ones for business and the best ones for impact. They'll be in the slide deck and we're happy to talk about them more. Catherine, I don't know if you've got anything you'd like to add there.
No, just to say, again, it is really important that we all align under the Race to Zero, and we are doing our best. You know, the whole purpose of creating this new government-led, UN-backed digital platform is to sort of align everyone under the same campaign, to make sure that where possible those other organisations are linking to that site. So when they're talking to small businesses about what they can do on net zero, they're then, you know, flagging the Race to Zero, pointing them towards the SME Climate Hub and sort of funneling them into that single sort of portal to the Race to Zero. So we can do our best.
Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going to have to move on. We will come back to some questions at the end of the supplementary questions area. I'm going to now share my screen briefly and try and show you what we have from our on-the-fly poll. So hopefully you can see my screen right now. And thank you for filling this in. I think some of you are still filling them in right now, and that's absolutely fine. It's very interesting to see the initial question there. Are you actually measuring your own business emissions? There we can see the lion's share. I think that's about 73% of businesses are doing that. So that's great to see, and that's always obviously going to be the baseline and the first thing that you do. Then we ask the question about measuring the supply chain footprint, and again, this will be an interesting one to take the poll now, as we have before we've heard everything from our friends at Bays and also from Miles in a moment there. But actually quite pleased to see that there are a good number of you, I think it's 22%, who are already measuring the supply chain footprint. So really good. And another 31% intending to do that in the next year. There are some of you who 22% intending to do it in the next 2 years, and just under a quarter not sure, because it looks a little bit difficult at the moment. So what I'm hoping we can do here is now introduce my colleague Miles Howard, and hopefully he'll be able to show you some of the simple ways that you can get started with supply chain carbon footprinting. Miles, over to you.
Thank you very much, Wendy. Yeah, if I just get my screen shared. There we go. There you go. What's that? So yes, so I'm Miles Howard. I've been working with Carbon Footprint for around 2 years now as an environmental consultant. So what I do as an environmental consultant is help organisations with their Scope 1 and 2 emissions. So that's getting started on your company's emissions, but then also going into your supply chain, looking at product footprints or sort of your overall supply chain. So within this talk, what we want to look at is how you can assess your supply chain, why you would assess your supply chain, so the benefits, as have already been discussed a bit today, when to start, so obviously that will be now, but I'll also give a timeline of how you can progress as you go. And as you've seen, some people are saying it could be too daunting of a task. Hopefully this will address some of them issues. On the first slide here, what we have is the greenhouse gas protocol for Scope 1, 2 and 3. So I'm sure a lot of you may have seen this. What we have is Scope 1 being your Site 1 direct fuels. Scope 2 would be your electricity that's used at your sites. So although typically when we talk about supply chain, a lot of people think it as your Scope 3 indirect emissions around what your own business is, your Scope 1 and 2 can quite likely be someone else's Scope 3 emissions, someone else's supply chain. So it is good to look into both your own and your full supply chain whilst you're doing that. So it's fully understandable that not everyone's looked into this yet. A lot of companies are just starting looking at their supply chain, and I'll talk more about the benefits and some procedures as we go forward. And obviously there's some quite typical emissions, and you'd expect for certain companies. So for manufacturing companies, it'll be quite easy to identify what are your Scope 3s and what are your supply chain emissions. And we have some on the screen, but obviously not all companies know directly what their Scope 3 are. So I'll also be talking about a screening process that we typically do with companies to help you determine what your high and likely Scope 3 hotspots are. As we go into the next slide here. So why measure and manage your supply chain carbon footprint? So obviously you can disclose it within your annual reports for transparency reasons. There's no sort of hard, you need to report for your full supply chain, but obviously it helps with Carbon Disclosure Project, Science-Based Target Initiative, and then you can also identify hotspots within your own supply chain. And these can reduce carbon, help you save costs, improve your overall sustainability. As we go into the next slide, what we have is we have the data availability. So as you come to look at your supply chain, it'll be quite typical that you won't know everything. You're not going to know and have data for your whole supply chain. So as you can see on this slide, we have primary, secondary and tertiary. This is sort of in a data form. So your primary data is if you had the exact usage for your supply chain, you had the exact emissions to manufacture, say, your products if you were manufacturing a product. Secondary data is looking at sort of average emission factors. So you may say you were manufacturing a plastic bottle. If you didn't know the exact process and you didn't have a good enough relation with supply chain to get data from that, you can use average emission factors for the production and the sort of production of the bottle. But obviously there's also lines around this where you can get sort of quite good secondary data if you can be quite specific on where the country is, what type of manufacturing for the plastic bottle there is, and then moving down to more averages. So all of this is about availability, and if you have sort of time, resources to look into this. What we have at the bottom, so quite likely to be very available, but not the best accuracy. So it can be a good starting point. And when I talk about the screening process, this is what we typically encourage. So what you have is you have a cost-based analysis to identify the key data sources. So what this can be is you can look at in your supply chain where the costs are coming from, and from this you can determine what type of carbon emissions there are, and then you can reduce as you go forward. So this is typically done as a gap analysis, and then what you might think is you'll start at tertiary and then you'll work your way up. Typically what you do is you'll do your cost analysis as a tertiary, and then it can be quite good to jump straight to primary and see, can we get this primary data? And then work down. If you can't get the primary data within a year or two, maybe you go to secondary and you look at more average emissions. So I'll talk about sort of timelines as we go through. What we have here is we have, like I mentioned, the spend-based carbon assessment, or this can be sort of, it can be done to look at your emissions in terms of a screening process. So it can use, based on your financial spend, and identify your hotspots. So you may find that you have quite a clear 3 key hotspots where you want to focus to collect data for in the future. And also you can report the findings of the cost-based assessment if you like, but obviously unless you start collecting data, you're not going to be able to see reductions properly. Within this also, so you can see I've got a table and a chart here. This is what we'd suggest. So you're collecting the data on your costs into your certain codes, so they can use the SIC codes, the standard industry code classifications, which are quite common in the UK, or you can use sort of more cost codes and other data sources. You can then get an idea of the breakdown of your emissions in terms of, say, if it was construction emissions, and all the different sources. So this would be where you target in the future. And this can't always be done directly on cost. So other tertiary data might be modeling of the data. So you may say you don't directly pay for the distribution downstream. So if you had a product, say the water bottle, and you were sending it downstream, you may not have the distribution emissions, you may not have the waste emissions data that you can collect, but you can model based on sort of UK average for plastic bottle waste or European averages. So again, this is identifying hotspots so you can target them in the future. So what we have is on this slide, we have the progression that you can go for, say year one, you can go 100% tertiary data, or if you've already done a carbon assessment and you know your scope 3 emissions, you know your flights, you know some business travel, which is quite typical if you've already done your own assessment, that can be where you start. So from year 2 onwards, you'd go slightly more of a hybrid approach. So you'd look at starting to collect that primary data, maybe moving into your secondary data if you can't find it. But you'd look in second year, maybe into the third year now, looking at your top 3 sources, identifying the hotspots. And hopefully, as you sort of shift towards this and you start using primary and secondary data, you'll also be able to track and measure the reductions that you're making. And then as we move into sort of year 3 and year 5, you're looking at getting a better understanding, and you can maybe even make decisions that can improve your supply chain. So you can look at going for more efficient suppliers. You can work with companies that have done their own assessments. But obviously, this is quite different for everyone. There will be cost, time, and resourcing that comes into this to decide how you're going to approach it. But this is quite typical in what we'd suggest, so going in for the tertiary data and working your way up. As we go into the next slide, so this is sort of additional benefits, market pressures that may help go towards the supply chain. So you can look to reduce your overall emissions. Obviously, that's what you want to aim for as you assess your supply chain. It can also be quite useful when you go for, say, tenders, say if you're a construction company and you've assessed your supply chain and you know the emissions that it takes you to input a project. It can help with the tendering process to show that you're understanding it and show that you know your own emissions. Also, it can help, so if you know your own supply chain, it also help you remain within other people's supply chains as you're showing you're doing your own assessments and you've got a good understanding. Also, as of current, it's seen as going above and beyond. Obviously, as more people do it, it'll be hopefully become more of the norm in the future, but you'll be able to show your environmental understanding, show your sort of green credentials, you've got differentiation of your branding, and you've got transparent market opportunities to say we're sort of carbon neutral, and we've also gone above and beyond with carbon neutral in the fact that we've also done all of our logistics, and there's a lot of benefits that you can show from there. So as we move into my next slide, what we have is we have the target setting. So target setting, I've got a bit about science-based targets here. So as mentioned in the previous slide, science-based targets do look for scope 3 emissions. This can typically be based on the 40, if your total emissions are above 40, if your scope 3 makes up 40% of your total emissions or more, it's likely you should be including them in a science-based target. And with that science-based targets, what you want to be doing is you want to be assessing your top 3 hotspots. That's why we've mentioned it previously, or they also look at 2/3 of the emissions. Certain science-based targets also looking to get the companies in company supply chains to sign up to do at least scope 1 and 2 assessments, sometimes scope 3. There are slight differences for SMEs. What an SME has is they currently only need to set targets on scope 1 and 2, but it's quite typical you'll need to tick to say that you're looking to assess your scope 3 and you're looking to make the reductions. Also, not just science-based targets, there's other targets you can put in place and you can directly target your scope 3 emissions. So you can, as I've got a small list here, there's many opportunities to reduce your emissions. So you can look at greener suppliers, local suppliers. If your weight came if your waste even came as your highest emission source, you may look at your reuse and reduction in terms of a hierarchy, and you can look at sort of reducing the amount of waste you have. Maybe it's mainly your packaging, you can reduce that. And then also you can go for more sustainable emission sources in terms of the packaging. So if it's quite a lot of plastic, maybe you'll move on to a different type of plastic or different types of cardboard. So overall, in terms of a recap, we're looking to identify strategies to reduce the carbon emissions for your supply chains. Hopefully this gives a bit of an idea of maybe where to start looking at in a cost-based analysis and working to start collecting the data. Hopefully identify some of the benefits, obviously reporting and showing people what you're doing, and identify the scope-free sources and ideas on sort of how to reduce your emissions. So I gave a few there on sort of waste and other sections and local suppliers, but there's a lot that can be done there. Lastly, we've got some information on the supply chain footprinting. There's a few slides here from sort of the Gov website and some other input models that you can get emissions. So based on your cost and spend, you can look at getting your emission sources and identify hotspots. And on this final page here, what we have is, and again, I've got a sort of table on how doing a cost-based analysis can identify some key points. And then also here's some details for our website, and feel free to sort of reach out if you have any questions on the scope-free emissions. One final thing I do want to mention, if I quickly go back one slide, what you have is the greenhouse gas protocol does give a very good idea on your scope-free emissions, and as you move into your primary and secondary, after you've done sort of maybe a tertiary assessment or at least looked into that, they give quite good background on what are the minimums for your scope-free and what you should be looking to calculate and include. It's quite a large document, but if you search in there for sort of minimums for reporting, you'll get quite a nice table that tells you what you need to look at calculating and collecting. But yeah, thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions at the end.
Many thanks, Miles. Miles has given us all, I think, quite a lot of homework to do there. There's a lot of content in there and some excellent references at the end.
I can see one question about science-based targets. So I can't talk directly to that, but obviously they, as you mentioned here, science-based target doesn't allow the offsetting and requires absolute reductions. So currently that is correct. You can offset, and they do recognize offsets, but not in making your reductions to reach your targets. But there are currently in development, as someone else has mentioned in the chat now, they are looking at developing this, and they're putting in some guidelines on types of offsetting projects you'd need to reach net zero based on that and what can be offset. Is there any more questions?
Excellent.
There's another question here, data on air and sea freight costs for 2020, how do I calculate? So there are a few links in there, feel free to get in touch after and we can have a bit of a chat about that. What else? But yeah, is this the same feedback form? I can post the link.
It is. Let me just point out again, you should be seeing the QR code back on the screen there. And if I could ask you again to raise your phones, please. This is where you can tell us how you thought about today. And also if you'd like to give a talk or you'd like to nominate a subject that for us to cover. The next one is scheduled to be about biodiversity and environmental impact assessments, and that's looking like that's going to be in May this year. And fingers crossed, with everything moving in the right direction, we're hoping to have a live event towards the end of the year on electric vehicles, so fingers crossed for that. What I would also say is these sessions only take place with the support of the three councils, Basingstoke and Dean Borough Council, Rushmore Borough Council and the Hart District Council, and we thank them for their support of these sessions. All that remains is for me now to close the session. If there are no further questions on here, and Miles is going to stay online for a little bit here, and we hope to see you at the future events. Do fill in that feedback form for us, and I wish you a very happy weekend. Thank you very much.